continuing our His Health series this week on Learn with Lo. Welcome, everybody. I am super pumped to be on episode 3. If you missed episodes 1 or 2 of our His Health series here in the month of June, we've been focused all on our guys this month, giving them lots of love and limelight here. Not that a lot of our conversations the other 365 days a year don't apply to our male counterparts. They absolutely do. But sometimes we can, like I said, kind of hone in and get a little bit more specialty on maybe talking about the ins and outs that pertain or feel like they pertain a little bit more towards our female demographic. And so I wanted to make sure that with this series, our guys felt like they got lots of love over the course of these 4 weeks. So we are on episode 3. If you missed the first 2 episodes, we really started to outline what that overall, like, kind of classic clinical picture is for a lot of males, either whether you're a female with males that you love in your life or you're a male follower out there. What are some of the common themes that a lot of our men tend to show up in clinic with? And some of the top occurrences, number 1 being low testosterone. So if you missed last week's episode, we talked all about the truths behind this picture of low testosterone and how we love that low testosterone is obviously getting its time in the spotlight, but we also talked about the very real physiological series of events that happens leading up to a male struggling with low testosterone or low testosterone symptoms that usually aren't talked about. And the very key conversations that I feel like absolutely need to be had even before something like testosterone replacement is on the table, or at least in conjunction with testosterone replacement therapy, to make sure that it's landing on the appropriate soil and that we're also understanding why and asking the question why testosterone might be low to begin with. And that is going to then lead us into today's series, which I feel like is another very common picture for our male population, and that is metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome sounds like a pretty vague and kind of all-encompassing term because it is. Metabolic syndrome is part of our category of cardiovascular disease risk. So as part of this metabolic syndrome, we are going to talk about the truths behind things like high cholesterol. We're going to talk about things like high triglycerides or high fasting glucose levels, things like insulin resistance, things like fatty liver disease. This metabolic syndrome is really just a conglomeration of different symptoms that we put together and title it under a syndrome called metabolic syndrome. Whenever you hear the term syndrome in conventional medicine, it's just a description of different symptoms. It doesn't necessarily tell us why or where they're coming from. It just tells us that, hey, this person has a cluster of themes, and we're going to call it all metabolic syndrome. Very common for my males, and a lot of times maybe it's some annual blood work that they had ran, and all of a sudden their cholesterol is sky high, and their practitioner maybe is recommending some pharmaceutical interventions or a statin. And this is sometimes the crossroads that guys are like, wait a second, I might need to think about my health a little different. I might need to take care of my health a little bit more proactively these days. And so they kind of start to question. They start to question, is pharmaceutical intervention the only option that I have for these trending numbers? And usually that leads them down maybe asking some of the same questions that I ask. And that is, why is my cholesterol high? Why is my blood sugar high? Why do I have fatty liver disease? What are some of these things trying to tell me versus maybe just throwing a pill at a symptom, but not actually ever addressing the source? So welcome to the Lowdown and my holistic medicine methodology, where we ask that question all the time. Like, I feel like it should be a game show at this point. Like, is it a symptom or is it the source? Because a lot of times, like I said, I think those conversations are not necessarily getting delineated within most of your conventional practitioners' offices, and this is the space where we're going to do that. So I do think before we get too far into it, one of the biggest hallmark and classic, maybe, like I said, markers of this metabolic syndrome piece usually revolve around cholesterol. I do think we need to have a quick conversation about the physiology behind cholesterol, what it actually is, because then it's going to start to make some real big light bulbs turn on into our kind of like current treatment and understanding of high cholesterol, and maybe have us start to ask better questions and maybe poke holes in that to understand we have more options. So when it comes to cholesterol, let's give it a little bit of a reframe. And I do think that takes us back to just a little brief science lesson. I swear I won't go in too deep. I'll make it nice and easy to understand because I want us to be able to all be on the same page here. What is cholesterol? Well, I want to say this like very loud and clear to start with. Cholesterol is not a toxin. Cholesterol is not the enemy. Cholesterol is not something to be obliterated at all costs within the human body. Otherwise, I don't think that the body would create it. Our body creates cholesterol endogenously in the liver. I don't think that our body would intentionally create something that is toxic and poisonous to us. It has a purpose, right? So at its core, cholesterol is an anti-inflammatory molecule. Who's ever told you that, right? It's true though. It's a repair molecule more than anything. So it's essential to human physiology. The body actually makes a majority of your cholesterol endogenously. About 80% of the cholesterol that you see on a lab panel, your body made that, your liver made that. 20% is going to come from exogenous, meaning dietary cholesterol, things that we eat, mostly animal products, okay? 80% is made endogenously in your liver, 20% comes from diet. I know a lot of times, like I said, the diet piece, like don't eat red meat, lower your egg intake. That was kind of our classic and outdated understanding of cholesterol because now we know better, okay? Now we know so much more. We know, number one, that cholesterol is an anti-inflammatory molecule. And cholesterol is also used to produce every single steroid hormone that we have in the body. Testosterone comes from cholesterol. Estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, all of these steroid hormones in the body, they come from a cholesterol backbone. So you better bet if you are overprescribed medication for lowering your cholesterol, you're probably going to have hormonal issues. Are we shocked? Are we surprised? No, you took away the body's building block, okay? It's gonna have issues with that. We also know that cholesterol is part of every single cell membrane in the body. It keeps the cell walls super fluid like this. Lack of cholesterol and they get really rigid and then things can't come in and out of those cell walls like they're supposed to. Cholesterol is also used to synthesize bile salts. So that bile that helps us absorb vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin K, vitamin E, the bile that comes from the liver and helps keep our gut nice and squeaky clean. Yep, cholesterol is in there. And I would say also cholesterol is really big in brain health. Your brain is roughly 60% fat from cholesterol. Cholesterol to me is like not optional, okay? And it's not something to be looked at to like obliterate at all costs. But what truly is that picture when we are seeing individuals who truly are struggling with elevations in cholesterol, whether that's in the 220s, 250s, 270s, 300s. I've seen cholesterol in the 500s. What's going on here, okay? We don't just ignore it. We have to ask why. Okay, why is the cholesterol elevated? Well, if it's an anti-inflammatory molecule, the body is sensing inflammation somewhere. And the body is like, hey, let me help. I'm going to try to create more cholesterol as a way to help you fight this inflammation, as a way to help repair any damage that the inflammation might be making all throughout the body. So it kind of makes common sense for us to know, okay, if there's inflammation, there's going to be higher cholesterol. But what we do is we treat the number on a lab. We put in a statin or we put in some supplements for your high cholesterol, but nobody's asking what the source of that is. Chronic inflammation from any source creates what is called oxidative stress, and that oxidative stress actually damages the interior lining of your blood vessels. So when you see cholesterol show up on a scan and they're like, oh, you have plaque, you have blockages, the cholesterol is there as a repair molecule. That would be like blaming the fire truck for a fire and being like, you started the fire, and the fire truck is like, no, I'm here to like put out the fire. That's what cholesterol is doing inside the lining of those blood vessels. It is there trying to repair the damage from bigger sources of oxidative stress. We can lower cholesterol all we want, but all we're doing is taking away the fire trucks. We're not putting out the source of the fire or asking who started the fire in the first place, okay? The question to me is not like, how do we lower this number? The question is, where is the inflammation coming from that is calling cholesterol to be upregulated in the first place? So When I see my, like I said, well-hearted men and the women in their life that love men, and maybe one of the very first markers that started to get their attention from annual blood work is this creeping cholesterol number, whether that's LDL or creeping total cholesterol. One of the most common themes is like, let's start a statin ASAP. Not saying that that's a bad thing, but it's like, what are we like? It should be, okay, here's a statin, and then here's an immediate referral to someone that can help you figure out why your cholesterol is elevated in the first place. So that way we have an exit strategy from said statin, because if we start to do the investigative work underneath, we can start to see that this theme of metabolic syndrome, high cholesterol, high triglycerides, high fasting blood sugar, even some of these things like, I was told I have fatty liver, but I don't even drink. Guys, these are all related together. You're not looking at 5 different labels, diagnoses. You are looking at one common pattern, and that is inflammation that is struggling to detox. That's essentially what you're looking at here. And then we're going to sit there and treat all of the individual symptoms of that versus look at the source. I think not. So the real culprits, usually when men show up in my clinic and we know that we have this like metabolic syndrome brewing, and they might feel it too. Usually it's fatigue. Usually it's reduced performance in the gym or in the bedroom. They feel like they can't gain lean muscle. They feel like they're kind of putting on more of that like dad bod, more of that like hard visceral fat across the abdomen. They may not be sleeping well. They may think that they have sleep apnea because now they snore as well too. All of these things are kind of like pretty classic for males that are starting to build this metabolic syndrome piece. And not anti-pharmaceuticals, but putting men on statins isn't fixing the problem, because the real culprits here is really where's the inflammation coming from. And the elevated cholesterol, the elevated cardiovascular disease risk, it all traces back to some pretty glaring sources. So when I'm doing more of a workup on my males, instead of just saying, okay, your only option is a statin, let's look at where the source is coming from. Number one, I'm always looking at multiple different markers of blood sugar regulation. Usually by the point that someone's developed like a fatty liver, high triglycerides, there's usually a pretty strong pattern of insulin resistance. Now, insulin resistance is very commonly overlooked for 2 different reasons. Number one, most conventional practitioners don't even measure fasting insulin. That's a problem. We're not going to be able to calculate or determine someone's insulin resistance score without fasting insulin. If we're going to sit there and wait for their fasting glucose to give us clues, you're going to have pre-diabetes and diabetes for probably a decade before your fasting glucose is actually going to pop and someone's going to say something about it. Let's be a little more proactive. We got to be drawing fasting glucose, fasting insulin, hemoglobin A1C, triglycerides. We got to start looking at like the ratios, relationships, and the patterns that are starting to emerge here. So usually under the influence of insulin resistance, there's this really definitive inflammatory cascade that is happening throughout the vascular system, okay? We see the arterial walls are going to become damaged. You get these small oxidized LDL particles that bump into the cell walls like BB guns, and they cause damage when they bump into the cell walls, and then cholesterol has to come in and repair that damage. We blame cholesterol when in reality it was the insulin resistance that made these little LDL particles sharp like BB gun pellets that are hitting the cell walls and causing damage in the first place. Then you're going to see their triglycerides rise. You're going to see HDL numbers drop. You're going to see visceral fat accumulation. It's like this domino effect that's pretty powerful across the board. But more often than not, we're waiting way too long to identify insulin resistance as a pattern, or we're waiting way too long to intervene on that, either from nutrition, lifestyle medicine, liver detoxification, strategic supplementation, and then we just kind of wait until it's inevitable that like, oh, here's a statin. Oh, you're now diabetic. It's like if the insulin resistance is what's driving the cortisol or the cholesterol elevation in the first place, the treatment is the insulin resistance, not a statin, right? So that would only kind of make sense. Very closely related to that insulin resistance picture is another source of inflammation that I commonly see coincide with high cholesterol or this metabolic syndrome, and that is fatty liver. One of the hallmarks of fatty liver is elevated triglycerides. So when you see the elevated triglycerides, we know that the liver is not processing these well, okay? Cholesterol's made in the liver, fatty liver deposits, high triglycerides, like it all kind of spells the same story, right? So when the liver kind of loses its ability to regulate cholesterol and triglyceride production, those fatty globules start to deposit in the liver, and then you can physically see them on a scan. You do not have to be a raging alcoholic to have fatty liver disease. This is a detoxification problem at its finest. So with this, elevated triglycerides to me are, like I said, one of the clearest signals of this process happening. Usually that means that there is fatty liver dysfunction. Usually it also means that there's insulin resistance brewing as well too. So the piece that I always kind of work my guys up for in this situation is if there is, like I said, the elevated triglycerides, the elevated cholesterol, especially if there's kind of a family history, there are some very key liver detoxification genetic deficiencies that are at play here. COMT enzymes, MTHFR enzymes. It's like, are people getting adequate workup for these to understand why do I have fatty liver? Why do I have elevated triglycerides? Because again, a statin is not going to fix that, especially like I said, if there are some obvious genetic factors at play. It's not a death sentence, but it's like, we need to add some specific markers to your lab panel to determine how those genetic pathways are either operating for or against you. One of the main ones being homocysteine, right? So with these guys, it's like, have you had your insulin levels run? Have you had your homocysteine levels run? If not, then how can I even build this picture around cholesterol? Sure, you can run cholesterol and just like put a Band-Aid on it, but I really need like to understand where this inflammation is coming from. So that's where things like fasting insulin numbers really help, homocysteine value really help on labs. And then last but not least, inflammation can absolutely be coming from the gut. This is where it feels like it's kind of removed from the liver, but dysbiosis, meaning too many bad guys, not enough good guys in the gut, that damages the gut lining as well too. And then you get what's called translocation. What's happening in the gut is not staying in the gut anymore. And the liver is going to very much feel the pressure of that dysbiosis, okay? So you're getting this like gut liver stress picture that is just feeding each other. And so when I have a guy that comes in and they have this brewing metabolic syndrome picture, cholesterol's up, triglycerides are up, blood pressure is up, their body fat percentage is up, I need to see what's going on. We need to cross-relay this with some of these other markers. Because if your cholesterol is slightly elevated, but your insulin levels look great, your homocysteine levels look great, you're overall asymptomatic, does it mean that I have to like panic about it? No. Okay, like we have to understand this like full picture that might be brewing. But I just don't think that enough guys really have that conversation around you have elevated cholesterol. That's a symptom. Let's go after the source. We need to rule in or rule out insulin resistance. We need to rule in or rule out fatty liver and some of the genetic detox variants that can determine that. We also need to rule in or rule out some severe cases of dysbiosis and leaky gut that are absolutely going to contribute to a cholesterol picture. Because even if you want to sit there and like artificially lower someone's cholesterol, the source of the inflammation behind the scenes is still brewing. And so it's just going to move, right? That inflammation marker is just going to move. So instead of high cholesterol, they're just going to get a high marker somewhere else. Their liver enzymes are going to start going up. Or like I said, their blood sugar starts going up. Or they're going to show those symptoms somewhere. It's just transferred. Okay, so I spelled this out a little bit, but when I think about this kind of complete actual picture for males in this kind of metabolic syndrome cascade, a lot of times they're just not getting complete labs either. So some of the things that I definitely would make sure that the males in your life have in terms of adequate labs, we definitely need to see fasting insulin. Ideally, that fasting insulin is below 7 is a good marker. Most of your kind of like diagnostic ranges on labs will be like, oh yeah, your insulin's fine as long as it's below 25. 25, like that number needs to definitely be below 7. If not, like below 10 is always my first goal. Below 7 would be ideal. So we're not going to sit there in those diagnostic reference ranges and let someone just sit in an active state of insulin resistance. So fasting insulin, obviously fasting glucose and A1C markers, which are becoming more common. Sometimes, like I said, it's even about ratios and relationships. So looking at things like a triglyceride to HDL ratio, I want to see that number below 2. So if you truly just divide your triglycerides by your HDL, you want that ratio below 2. Very classic hallmark way that you can determine, do I have insulin resistance or not? If that number is above 2, the progression of insulin resistance is there for sure. I mentioned it too, some of these inflammatory markers like HSCRP or a homocysteine marker. Yes, gold. I love these markers on labs because they're going to give a lot more context to that overall metabolic syndrome picture. And then liver enzymes. AST, ALT, alkaline phosphatase, GGT, like these are labs that should absolutely be run so that we can start to really build that full picture of cholesterol and metabolic syndrome and not just sit there and say, oh, we're going to treat one number on a lab and act like you're somehow healthier because of it. No one did anything about the raging inflammation, and that's what my brain just can't help but dig into. So if you're a fellow practitioner out there, and especially all of these like lab conversations, knowing what labs to order, knowing ideal reference ranges, looking at pictures and patterns and ratios and relationships, don't forget about my upcoming 4-week clinical intensive course that starts on June 24th. That's for all my practitioners out there. That is going to be a 4-week boot camp in teaching you how to transform functional blood chemistry from just markers into actual meaning. So I know a lot of practitioners, like I said, want to get more clinical toolbox in just learning how to interpret blood work more holistically for their clients. And then for, like I said, all of my patients out there, or any men out there or women that have men loved ones in their life, make sure that, like I said, you're sharing this with them. Make sure that you feel like you're going into your provider appointments more proactive. If you feel like you can't get this type of testing or like a viewpoint that I've been describing here, click the link in my bio. You can schedule a one-on-one appointment for us where we can make sure you get the labs ordered and also the lab interpretation that you deserve to really make sure that you're understanding where am I at in this overall metabolic syndrome piece. Is things like pharmaceutical interventions the only options for this trending picture, or is it my body asking for a deeper dive into where that inflammation is coming from? Hopefully this was helpful, and we will see you guys again next week.